Good evening and welcome to the Gospel Truth. I'm Brother Alan Jackson, bringing to you spiritual songs and hymns and the power of the spoken word of God. First of all, giving thanks to God Almighty for blessing me with this another opportunity yet beyond this the time side of life, and to have this another blessed privilege to come to you in His name by way of this television medium, and to bring to you another message from His holy and divine word. And as I always do, I'd like to continue to express my appreciation and my gratitude to the production staff for their diligent service to the gospel truth. It's my prayer that God will continue to bless each one of them with those things that He knows that they are standing in need of. And I'm praying on your behalf as participant observers. And it's my prayer that God will continue to bless you and your family members with those things that He knows that you are standing in need of as well. And then, of course, I'm encouraging you to pray on my behalf because I'm also standing in need of prayer. And it's only God who can provide me with those things that I am standing in need of. And here it is February, and once again, the Gospel Truth will pay tribute to Black American history. This year, 2017, with the changing of the White House guard, and the rhetoric of make America great again, I believe that it is necessary for us as a people to reflect back over our history in an effort to reignite our quest for justice and equality. It has been said that if you don't know your history, you are bound to repeat it. This week and next week, I'm bringing you a glimpse of history and my experience as a Black American here in America. Hopefully, it will stimulate your motivation and enable you to get busy working and organizing efforts to make us as God's people greater than before. Please bring your children in and have them to see what it took for us as Black people to get to where we are today. Now, in view of our current administration, we must be vigilant, prepared, and ready. And so now, America in the 20th century, the civil rights movement.
But in the mid-1950s, a new generation of activists mounted a campaign of direct political action and nonviolent protest to exorcise Jim Crow and its violent legacy once and for all. Their fight for freedom and equality became known as the modern civil rights movement. December 1st, 1955, a department store seamstress boarded a city bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Her name was Rosa Parks. She was a Negro. When the bus driver ordered Ms. Parks to surrender her seat to a white man, she refused and was arrested. The popular legend of the tired seamstress reveals only part of the story. Rosa Parks was a seamstress, and she was tired. Just tired of giving in, she would write years later. She was also an active member of the NAACP. By the time Rosa Parks was arrested, community leaders had a plan in place to boycott Montgomery's segregated bus system. They were just waiting for the right person to be arrested. Someone who would anger the Negro community into action. Someone of unimpeachable character. Someone like Rosa Parks. Within days, the Montgomery Improvement Association was formed to guide the Montgomery bus boycott. It was the first large-scale and enduring protest for Negro rights. For leadership, the protesters chose a young Baptist minister, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Signs were posted around town. Don't ride the bus today. Don't ride it for freedom. The boycotters organized carpools. They rode in taxicabs. They walked. Through heat and cold, rain and snow, they refused to ride the bus. The city of Montgomery lost as many as 35,000 fares each day during the boycott. But even as weeks turned to months, they refused to meet with demands for more courteous service, equal seating privileges, and the hiring of Negro bus drivers. Instead, they held fast to their segregationist convictions and filed suit against movement leaders. Even under attack, King and the others would not be provoked to violence.
We still feel that we are right and that we stand within our constitutional rights in the protest. And we still advocate nonviolence, passive resistance, and still determined to use the weapon of love.
In November 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a ruling that declared segregated busing to be unconstitutional. The protest ended a month later, 381 days after it began. The Montgomery bus boycott was a major victory against racial segregation and propelled the civil rights movement to national attention. Martin Luther King became its public face and voice, its most influential leader, and its most lucrative target. During the bus boycott, King's Montgomery home was bombed and shot at. He was harassed and arrested. For King and the cause, it was symbolic of the determined opposition and deadly violence that lay ahead. In the wake of the Montgomery victory, Martin Luther King brought together other black ministers and community leaders to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. King, as its president, the SCLC championed voter registration drives and supported bus boycotts in other parts of the South. At about the same time, President Eisenhower's Attorney General, Herbert Brownell Jr., drafted a proposal for new civil rights legislation. It was universally opposed by Southern legislators. Nevertheless, Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson guided a diluted bill to final passage by a 60-15 vote, establishing the Civil Rights Act of 1957. The NAACP's Roy Wilkins dismissed it as a crumb from Congress. Even so, it was the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. The law provided new authority to the Justice Department to oversee elections and investigate officials who interfered with voter registration. It also created a new division within the Justice Department to prosecute civil rights violations. The legislation was a symbolic victory for King and other civil rights leaders, but not enough to silence their rising demand for full legal, economic, and social equality. In some cases, the most deafening statements were made without uttering a word. 1960, in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 freshman college students walked into a Woolworth's drugstore and sat down at a lunch counter reserved for whites. The Greensboro Four, as they became known, were refused service, but they remained seated in silent protest until the store closed. Their sit-in continued for weeks and ignited a wave of similar demonstrations. Within months, the movement reached every southern state and attracted more than 50,000 students.
They come in and they sit down, and we're not used to them sitting down beside us because I wasn't raised with them. I never have lived with them, and I'm not going to start now.
Demonstrators encountered humiliation, abuse, and police harassment, but they held fast to their principles of passive resistance. During a sit-in staged in Nashville, Tennessee, silent protesters were chided with insults and attacked. They refused to fight back, but 81 demonstrators were arrested anyway on charges of disorderly conduct. The arrests galvanized the Nashville student movement. Student leader Diane Nash led 3,000 protesters in the first major march of the civil rights movement. The aim? To challenge Mayor Ben West to take a stand on segregation.
And we needed him to say integrate the counters, or to tell Nashville to do what Nashville knows it should have done a long time ago, like about 95 years ago after the Civil War. So I asked the mayor, first of all, Mayor West, do you feel that it's wrong to discriminate against a person solely on the basis of his race or color?
Ultimately, the answer was yes. Within a month, Nashville became the first major city in the South to begin desegregating its public facilities. Building on the success of the sit-in movement, Nash and others formed a new organization to harness the energy of young people for the cause of civil rights, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. Younger and more aggressive than the senior civil rights organizations, SNCC members became the shock troops of the revolution, willing to take the fight to the racist enemy in the most intolerant parts of the South. The sit-in protests attracted the first widespread media coverage of the civil rights movement. Photographs and film footage from places like Nashville provided many Americans with their first glimpse of the racism and discrimination that had infected the South for generations. News reports in October 1960 that Martin Luther King had been jailed for participating in a sit-in were brought to the attention of a young senator campaigning to be president. John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts was not a supporter of civil rights, but he recognized that political capital could be gained by reaching out to Negroes. At the urging of his advisors, Kennedy intervened on behalf of the incarcerated civil rights leader and helped win his release.
Well, I owe a great debt of gratitude to Senator Kennedy and his family for this. I don't know the details of it, but naturally I'm very happy to know of Senator Kennedy's concern and all that he did to make this possible.
The maneuver paid off. With King's endorsement, candidate Kennedy carried 70% of the nation's black vote and won the presidency by the narrowest of margins. As the new president assumed office in January 1961, many blacks rightfully expected bold new civil rights initiatives. But Kennedy had other priorities. His New Frontier proposals required the support of Southern Democrats, and Cold War concerns in Cuba, Berlin, Vietnam, and elsewhere left little room on the presidential agenda for civil rights. But the demand for change could not be quieted. The Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, spearheaded the movement's boldest initiative to date, the Freedom Rides, a descent into the Deep South by bus to test compliance with Supreme Court rulings barring segregated interstate travel. CORE founder James Farmer acknowledged the perilousness of the journey.
I think all of us were prepared for as much violence as could be thrown at us. We were prepared for the possibility of death.
On May 4, 1961, 2 buses departed Washington, D.C., carrying black and white volunteers into forbidden territory. These were the first Freedom Riders. In Atlanta, they parted for the journey through Alabama. When the first bus reached Anniston, it was attacked and firebombed. The Freedom Riders barely escaped alive. The second bus met a similar fate in Birmingham. The city's notorious public safety commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor, made good on his promise to allow Klansmen 15 minutes to do their dirty work.
And with me are part of a group calling themselves the Freedom Riders, an interracial group traveling through the Deep South to challenge some of the segregated bus facilities in this part of the country. Yesterday they ran into trouble. They ran into violence. Today they say they intend to keep up their pilgrimage.
The attacks left the Freedom Riders wounded, terrified, and trapped among those who had tried to kill them. In Washington, the reaction of President Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was mixed. But it was too late to turn back. SNCC leader Diane Nash recognized this as a watershed moment.
If they stop us with violence, the movement is dead. We are coming.
Nash sent SNCC volunteers to replace the battle-weary core group in Birmingham. Learning of this, the president lost his composure. All hell is going to break loose. She's going to get those people killed. The situation fell to Bobby Kennedy. As head of the Justice Department, he was empowered to intervene if he suspected federal laws were being violated. He dispatched his assistant, John Siegenthaler, to Birmingham to rescue the Freedom Riders. On May 20th, Siegenthaler boarded a Birmingham to Montgomery Greyhound bus, along with the SNCC reinforcements. Their arrival in Montgomery was met by a mob of more than 1,000 screaming racists. Some Freedom Riders were able to flee, but others were overwhelmed by fists, iron pipes, axe handles, and baseball bats. John Lewis was beaten and bloodied. Siegenthaler himself was struck in the head with a pipe and kicked unconscious. With no other option, Attorney General Kennedy asserted federal authority by ordering 400 U.S. Marshals to Montgomery to restore order and escort the Freedom Riders to safety. Bobby Kennedy began to see the civil rights debate in a new light, not as one issue among the thousands confronting the administration, but as the defining moral issue of the era. As a first step, he petitioned the Interstate Commerce Commission to adopt new regulations that would stiffen already existing federal laws, requiring all interstate transportation facilities to be integrated. But more importantly, the younger Kennedy's attitude influenced the president's evolving position on civil rights. In 1963, Southern segregationists got a new rallying cry, and the civil rights movement gained a new arch-villain. But even as Alabama's incoming governor, George Wallace, invoked the spirit of the Confederacy, movement leaders were preparing to challenge segregation and racial hatred in the state's largest city, Birmingham. Eugene Bull Connor embodied the entrenched prejudice of the Old South. He had given Klansmen free rein to beat the Freedom Riders in 1961, just as he allowed them to persecute Birmingham's black population and firebomb their homes with impunity. By 1963, the public outrage sparked by the Freedom Rides and other high-profile civil rights demonstrations had disappeared. King and the SCLC launched Project C on April 3, 1963. The C stood for the Confrontations, designed to bait Bull Connor into outrageous action. 9 days in, the campaign was in trouble. Martin Luther King had been arrested for violating a court order and was languishing in jail. It was here that he penned his famous Letter from a Birmingham Jail, concluding that one day the South will recognize its real heroes. King was released from jail on April 20th to find the Birmingham movement in peril. With few adults willing to risk jail time, the city's black youth rose up and marched into history. At 1 o'clock on May 2nd, D-Day, a group of students emerged from the 16th Street Baptist Church singing, "We Shall Overcome." Hundreds were arrested and loaded onto school buses destined for the city jail. The next day, Bull Connor called in the fire department and K-9 units. Teenagers and children became targets for high-pressure water hoses and snarling police dogs. News reports and images from Birmingham spread like wildfire. The New York Times called the events a national disgrace that made a mockery of the legal process. A letter to the Washington Post read, "If the United States doesn't stand for some decent average level of human dignity, what does it stand for?" Bull Connor filled the jail and then the county fairground with thousands of youthful prisoners. But still, more came. Birmingham business leaders finally agreed to negotiate. Within days, an accord was reached to desegregate the city. President John F. Kennedy.
Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century, to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law. The old code of equity law under which we live commands for every wrong a remedy. But in too many communities, in too many parts of the country, wrongs are inflicted on Negro citizens and there are no remedies at law. Unless the Congress acts, their only remedy is the street.
The president's call for federal civil rights legislation held staggering implications, but the opposition remained intractable and dangerous. The president was forced to use federal troops to ensure the admission of James Meredith, the first black student to attend the University of Mississippi in 1962. In Alabama, Governor George Wallace, who had promised segregation forever, staged his historic Stand in the Schoolhouse Door to oppose the integration of the University of Alabama. Only after federal troops arrived on orders of the president did Wallace relent, allowing Vivian Malone and James Hood to enter. And just hours after President Kennedy called on the nation to embrace civil rights, NAACP Field Secretary Medgar Evers was gunned down at his home in Jackson, Mississippi. In the wake of Birmingham and the president's proposed civil rights legislation, Negro leaders announced a mass march to galvanize nationwide support for civil rights. For decades, this had been the dream of labor leader A. Philip Randolph.
Negroes want the same things that white citizens possess. All of their rights. They want no reservations. They want complete equality, social, economic, and political. And no force under the sun can stem and block and stop this civil rights revolution which is now underway.
Randolph first raised the idea of a mass march in 1941, when he used it as a threat to encourage President Franklin Roosevelt to end segregation in federal government agencies and among defense contractors. 20 years later, Randolph's dream became reality. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom would be the greatest mass protest in the nation's history. Thousands set off for the nation's capital to show their support for civil rights. They came by car, by bus, by rail. Many who opposed civil rights predicted violence, but the march organizers went to great lengths to ensure none came. A quarter of a million participants, some say even more, converged on the Mall in Washington, D.C. But the one who enunciated their universal call for justice most passionately was Martin Luther King Jr.
Because I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
History was written today which will have its effect on coming generations with respect to our democracy, with respect to our ideals, with respect to the great struggle of man toward freedom and human dignity.
And I think this march will go down as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, demonstrations for freedom and human dignity ever held in the United States.
President Kennedy welcomed the leaders at the White House. His ambivalence toward civil rights had evaporated. With a 60% approval rating, the president looked forward to a second term in which he would consolidate public support for his civil rights proposals and press Congress to enact legislation. But it was not to be. On November 22nd, 1963, the president was assassinated in Dallas, Texas.
The greatest leader of our time has been struck down by the foulest deed of our time. Today, John Fitzgerald Kennedy lives on in the immortal words and works that he left behind. John F. Kennedy told his countrymen that our national work would not be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration. But he said, let us begin. Today, in this moment of new resolve, I would say to all my fellow Americans, let us continue.
Johnson vowed to revolutionize America with federal aid to education, tax cuts to stimulate business, conservation programs, and to pass the civil rights legislation proposed by the late president. He called it the Great Society. Just days earlier, 3 young civil rights workers had disappeared while working to register black voters in Mississippi. President Johnson ordered FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to probe the disappearance. On the first day of Freedom Summer, June 21st, 1963, Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner left project headquarters in Meridian to investigate the burning of a black church in neighboring Neshoba County. They were never heard from again. Within days, the FBI turned up the remains of their burnt-out station wagon, but there was no sign of the boys. As the intense search continued, locals refused to cooperate with investigators. The word on the street was, if they were killed, they got what was coming to them. 44 days into the investigation, the FBI received an anonymous tip. Then the buzzards sensed what lay beneath the Mississippi clay.
Mr. President? Yeah. Mr. Hoover wanted me to call you, sir, immediately and tell you that the FBI has found 3 bodies 6 miles southwest of Philadelphia, Mississippi. We have not identified them as yet as the 3 missing men, but we have every reason to believe that they are the 3 missing men.
The gruesome discovery solved half the mystery. Finding and prosecuting those responsible remained.
J. Edgar Hoover on 9-1.
Edgar, I wanted to call you last night. I wanted to congratulate you on a job well done.
That's awfully nice of you indeed. You might be interested, the physical examination showed that each of these men had been shot.
Huh.
The 2 white men had been shot once each, and the colored fellow was shot 3 times.
Huh.
And we have the names of the people who did it. Now, to prove it is going to be a little tougher job. The sheriff was in on it. The deputy sheriff was in on it. The justice of the peace was in on it. And there were 7 other men. But we have all those names, and as I say, we're concentrating now on developing the evidence